Now, we can go around and around in circles about trying to talk about and defining socialism, but at its core, I was intrigued by an op-ed that I saw not too long ago by a Democrat from Cuba commenting on one of our colleagues, an avowed socialist, and essentially pointing out the extent to which democratic socialism is a lot like the system my family fled, except its proponents promised to be nicer when seizing your business. And that's the truth. That's the truth here. And so we can talk about these terms as if they don't matter, but they do. They do matter. They're actually at the core of who we are. I've got one question for the ranking member, Ranking Member Waters. In a 2008 hearing, you said, quote, "And guess what this liberal will be all about? This liberal will be all about socializing, would be about basically taking over the government and the government running all of your companies," end quote. Simple question, do you stand by that statement?
Simple answer. I am here today in this Rules Committee because we're taking up time with basically a non-issue. First of all, you claim that socialism has engulfed this country, that it keeps creeping, it's going to take over private businesses, et cetera, et cetera. That is not happening. We're in a democracy that we're trying very much to save and to not have disrupted, undermined in the way that...
So then, reclaiming my time, the gentlelady denounces your previous statement then, and do not accept that previous statement that you think you would take over these private businesses?
I'm not a socialist. I'm a capitalist, and I commit to you that I am here to save Social Security, to save Medicare, to save seniors and veterans, and for some of you who have adopted certain kind of ways that you support what you now claim is socialism, I'm here to say to you, come on.
So this liberal will be all about socializing, will be all about basically taking over and the government running all of your companies. You disagree with that? You now denounce that statement?
I am not a socialist.
Okay.
All right?
So I appreciate the response. I think that to the extent that one has a concern as a member of this body or as an American watching this, one has concerns when we hear statements like this, and that's not the only one. And statements by some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle extolling the virtues of socialism, as I just pointed out. A nicer way of confiscating businesses, a nicer way of confiscating the assets and the means of production. When now, as I think the gentleman from Kentucky was alluding to, in 1929, federal spending was 3% of GDP. At the height of COVID, 31% of GDP. In FY22, we collected a record $4.9 trillion in revenue, but still had a $1.4 trillion deficit. I think one question I would ask the chairman of Financial Services is, do you have full control over the means of production if you're a company in this country, but yet the government is regulating you so much that you cannot actually carry out the use of the capital for the purpose for which you have the company created? In other words, for example, ESG requirements. For example, maybe it's some of the USDA regulations requirements that prohibit small businesses from being able to crack into the monopolies that the gentlelady from New Mexico is referring to with respect to meat processing in this country. There are heavy USD regulations prohibiting that, as the gentleman from Kentucky has talked to, and I'm happy to yield to him in a minute if he would like. We could go and sit here for the next 5 days without adjourning. No, don't worry, Mr. Chairman, I won't do that. And go through a list of regulations that are impacting businesses in this country. So my question for the chairman is, do you have the full control over the means of production as a private citizen, business owner in our capitalistic system, if the government regulation is preventing you from being able to deploy that capital in the best means possible to carry out your business?
No. And this is what we're trying to address.
A tense confrontation in the House Rules Committee has spotlighted a fundamental ideological divide in Washington. as Representative Chip Roy leveraged historical records to challenge Ranking Member Maxine Waters on her past advocacy for government intervention in the private sector. The exchange, which moved quickly from a discussion on procedural rules to a debate over the core tenets of the American economy, centered on a 2008 statement made by Waters regarding the socializing of private companies. Reporting from the committee room, the atmosphere shifted when Representative Roy presented a verbatim quote from 18 years prior. In the 2008 recording, Representative Waters stated that her brand of liberalism would be focused on the government, taking over and running private enterprises. When Roy posed the direct question of whether she still stood by those words, the proceedings took an unexpected turn. Rather than a direct confirmation or retraction, Waters initially dismissed the inquiry as a non-issue and a distraction from the committee's immediate business. As the exchange intensified, Waters explicitly distanced herself from the socialist label, declaring, "I am not a socialist. I am a capitalist." She argued that her legislative focus remains on preserving social safety nets like Social Security and Medicare rather than dismantling private industry. However, Roy countered that the capitalist label is inconsistent with a regulatory environment that effectively strips business owners of their autonomy. The debate expanded into a broader critique of the administrative state. Roy argued that ownership on paper is meaningless if federal regulations, ranging from ESG requirements to USDA mandates, dictate how a company deploys its capital. He presented a historical comparison of federal spending, noting that it has ballooned from 3% of GDP in 1929 to over 30% in recent years. Roy's thesis suggests that the United States is experiencing a form of socialism by regulation, where the government exerts control not through direct ownership, but through an impenetrable wall of compliance costs that favor large corporations while stifling small business competition. By the end of the session, the dialogue had moved beyond simple political labels to address a growing fiscal reality. Record-high federal revenues are currently being outpaced by trillion-dollar deficits. While Waters maintained that government intervention is necessary to protect the vulnerable, Roy used the Congresswoman's own historical words to argue that the underlying goal of many in Washington remains the consolidation of economic power within the federal government. The exchange concluded with a stark visual of the friction between career political branding and the permanent public record.